The Department of Energy does not have a lead role in Ebola response, and so kind of a natural question is, well, why are we doing anything here? Why should we care? So I wanted to give you a little bit of context of why we got involved with this, and then talk to you about how we thought about it, how we started this, what we ended up doing, and perhaps was it useful, everything we did to date, and what we might do in the future, thinking about whatever might come next. You know, there is a historical context for why the Department of Energy has been interested in medical impacts and biology. You know, historically from the nuclear weapons programs, it was the understanding the health impacts of ionizing radiation. So it's kind of a legacy of our past 5 or more decades of experience in trying to look hard at some of these questions of ionizing radiation, which required kind of a deep understanding of individual chromosomes, evaluation of genetic differences, and understanding effects. And so it led the department into this area, and we've cultivated since then a fairly deep and broad bench of experts across the laboratories. And so it was a natural place to start in thinking about Ebola. You know, historically also, the Department of Energy, together with National Institute of Health, formed the MOU that started the Human Genome Project, which ran from effectively 1990 to 2003. And so the labs were fairly deeply immersed in that as well. As part of the ongoing interest in the labs today, biofuels is out there, synthetic biology, we're certainly interested in that. And there have been many spin-off companies, including multi-billion-dollar companies today that came out of the laboratories. I think Cepheid is a $4 billion a year company, but there are also some smaller ones which were startups spun out of the laboratories as ideas emerged. So, you know, it's not just a project-based activity, but it's fairly deeply ingrained into how we think about it. And at the same time, so is computer simulation. And so we are invested in this. We're almost the Department of Modeling, if you will. And so we think of a lot of what we do through prediction, because often the situations we face are complex and can't be solved any other way than trying to figure out numerically how to best approach these problems. We got involved with Ebola following the president's speech at the United Nations, I think it was last Thursday in September of last year, where he called it a global security crisis, and he asked for an all-hands-on-deck approach to solving this. Remember, at that time, the predictions from the CDC were for 1.4 million to be infected by January of this year. And as we thought about the issue of travel bans and what the impacts might be of, you know, in global megacities of this traveling to India or China or other parts of the world, certainly the US, we didn't know what any of this meant. And those aren't things where we have a richness of data to draw upon to make a, you know, a analytic calculation or a prediction. And so we were, you know, really led to modeling as a basis for this, recognizing that none of the models are good, and recognizing our experience with Ebola was at the 100 times lower level than where we were at, right? The previous epidemics had been at about, you know, 100 people to a few hundred people over the last decades, and now we were faced with something in the tens of thousands. I think to date there were about 25,000 infected, 10,000 plus have died, and largely in West Africa, and so we were scaling from an experience base of mutations at a few hundred people, localized, to something spreading through West Africa and potentially more globally, 100 times bigger, with a virus that mutates quickly. And it's like a bad copy machine. You know, it makes mistakes at the rate of 1 in 10 to the 5, And so not all of these are significant, but nevertheless, the fact that it's fast and it mutates, got you thinking, well, what happens now when you scale this up 100-fold? Are there things that we should really be getting our heads around and predicting and worrying about? And so this is what led us down this road. Following the president's speech, our secretary engaged colleagues at Health and Human Services, as well as State Department and others, to try and understand how we could best be brought to bear. The things that we started to propose, and we put together a white paper at that time following the president's speech on how DOE could become a support player for some of the decisions that would have to be made in the government. We were initially starting with viral evolution as one of the key areas. Viral evolutions, again, because we have a fair amount of experience in how you model realistically on a big computer with a scalable code, a very complex protein that is evolving in media at finite temperature, and trying to understand then what happens with countermeasures. If you have, at the time it was ZMapp as a medical countermeasure, if you mutate the Ebola, and as it evolves, does that modify the efficacy of ZMapp? It's a computational problem. What is it that would render these diagnostics ineffective? We wanted to think about how you would track novel strains that could evade diagnostics. Think about the evolutionary analysis. Again, because it was evolving quickly, we wanted to understand the spread and how quickly it might be changing. And one of the things that our laboratories have been doing historically, because, again, the principal mission in nuclear weapons are clouds of predictions. One of the things we're forced to do, because we work typically in a dearth of data and have to make predictions on complex multi-scale problems, is we tend to inject uncertainty quantification as best we can. We try and make clouds of predictions with the best available models, not all ours, whoever's models we can use to try and bracket our understanding, similar to what you see in hurricane predictions. But it's something we have a fairly deep experience base, and it's something we thought we could bring to bear, because docking models are notoriously poor, I would say, in terms of predicting what drugs would bind to proteins, and so it was clear there wasn't a single model we could turn to do this. So viral evolution was a place we thought computationally intensive, something you would scale up on the big systems. Docking was an interesting place to start. We thought about something called the Prestwick Chemical Library, which has about, I think, 1,280 fully FDA-approved chemicals that you could then use to dock against various mutations of the Ebola virus. And then you could take everything that we know that's approved and see where there was any frequency of success, and at least try and gauge, using different docking models, the efficacy of different classes of solutions. And so, as we were thinking over the weekend on places we could go, these are some of the places that we gravitated to. Multiscale modeling, of course, was a natural thing that probably comes on every one of our lists of activities we do, just because we somehow view the world that way. And again, as we think about global megacities, when the laboratories were modeling the 2009 influenza pandemic, the U.S. needed decision support on countermeasures, economic impacts of decisions, and so on, and we were able to model every citizen in the U.S. It was, 300 million people, no problem. You put in your agent-based model, your sense of, your best guesses on behaviors and so on, and you can at least inform decisions rather than just make some guesses. And so that was back in 2009. Today, I mean, it's not a problem when you think of billions of people on the planet. If you wanted to model everybody, you could. The question is, how do you get the right data to validate any of this? So, there was a data issue in all of this. The computing side was not too hard because scalable codes are pretty readily available these days. But we had problems with data. And we thought about incorporating traditional data and non-traditional data. Can we get epidemiological models to incorporate things that you might be able to get off the web, or cell phone data, or different kinds of data that you could feed into the more traditional Ministry of Health data. Data we found, no surprise, was often incomplete, could be inaccurate at times, was not exactly what you wanted. And so with the paucity of data, it was always hard to figure out the best approach where you could at least bracket predictions. There were interesting problems in West Africa at that time. Also in the fall, it was coming out of the wet season. And so we were worried about, people who were in villages that were enclosed were suddenly going to open up, and suddenly there would be new pathways of communication, of moving. How do you track that? And so there were interesting issues there in gathering the data and trying to figure out what was going to happen. With the agent-based modeling, again, these are stochastic simulators that work pretty well in looking at the spread of disease in regions, which you can use to assess prevention and intervention and response. At the time, because they were worried in West Africa about the spread of Ebola. If you had any symptoms, you were drawn into these Ebola treatment units. If you had a cold, or if you had malaria, you would be drawn in with patients next to you who had Ebola, potentially. And the time it took to get your blood sample analyzed was days. It wasn't hours, something you could do here in the US. And so the logistics issue was something we were thinking about at that time. How could we think about about the pathways between portable laboratories and the treatment units that could optimize the response? So we ended up sending people into the field, into West Africa, to work with health officials to try and understand these facts, to get the data, to work then in real time with our laboratory modeling people, in particular at Sandia for this one, to understand what data we could get and how that would in real time provide response to the questions being asked. There were a lot of questions that were coming up that we didn't quite know how to best approach, but the travel ban was one of those interesting problems of, which on the surface makes sense. Sure, we should do a travel ban, we should restrict people traveling to the US, but that had, when we did the modeling at our laboratories, we found actually you would increase the number of undiagnosed people entering the country with the proposed travel ban. Again, with error bars, but as you looked at the pathways of people who would, there was no direct flight first, so you have to go through intermediate cities. You could, of course, get a new ticket from your next destination. You could leave from an airport in an unaffected airport, an unaffected region of Africa. And so there are many different pathways when you think about what a travel ban would mean to people and their behavior. As you try to do the modeling, you list your assumptions, you can find some surprising things that it doesn't exactly do what you think it's doing. We started to look at hospital preparedness as well. A lab like Argonne and Oak Ridge became involved. We put together an Ebola task force in the department. We had 7 laboratories involved together with us at headquarters to try and ask some of these big questions and interface with Health and Human Services as well as the White House and other places to figure out how we could provide the best support. The hospital response, hospital preparedness was an interesting one that we started thinking about. Argonne National Lab has this nice MRSA code. It's an antimicrobial resistance model, agent-based model that they use to understand what would happen in the city of Chicago. If you had a major problem with MRSA. So they have a fairly detailed model of Chicago, which we asked them to scale up onto their blue gene architecture, which they were able to do fairly quickly and change the attributes from MRSA to Ebola. At the same time, we were watching in real time kind of what was happening in Dallas, where a single patient, totally gummed up the system. At the time, we, the U.S., simply didn't know how to deal with that much BSL-4 waste. I think a single patient was producing about, 10 liters a day of BSL-4 waste that had no waste stream, back end of where to put this, so it was just stacked. What do you do with this when you don't have, when you don't have the policy in place on how to dispose of it? We were faced with new problems. Also, the fact that anyone who touched or was close to a patient was glued to that patient. That's all they could do. So if you were involved in treatment of somebody, that was everything you did. And so it immediately sequestered a large number of healthcare workers just because of a single patient. And so we started to think, well, what is the U.S. capacity for an Ebola epidemic here? What can we actually do? How many can we handle? We were talking to some hospitals in New York who said our capacity is 5. That's the most we could do, 3 adults and 2 kids. The fellow in New York who was walking around Manhattan, who went bowling in the Bronx or somewhere and then took the subway and then eventually came down with symptoms, the hospital had to provide 500 contact tracers for that one person. So they simply reassigned duties of those doing childhood immunizations and so on. All of everyone's day job was walking through the city and doing contact tracing to figure out who met with whom. And so, as you think about this, what is it we can actually support with our current hospital model? And so we started to take this model of Chicago, of all of the infrastructure, and Oak Ridge was adding in a model there. Gil Wygant was doing that with Chick McCall at Argonne as part of our Ebola task force to try and understand what is the full capacity of a city. How many can we take? When you look at the entire system, from transportation networks to waste streams to the hospital, the entire system. And we got a fair way down that path, and there's more to do. But I think it's a very relevant question because I don't think anyone believes this is the last time we will be faced with some kind of biological threat like this. There are certainly more to come, and the question is, how do we think forward now? What are the tool sets we should have? What do we learn from this, and how do we think about injecting simulation into this more strongly? I think it's a field that, in looking back at what we did over the past 5 or 6 months, that has a lot of potential and is in deep need for thinking in this area. And so it's a fascinating area, and it impacts us all fairly directly. As soon as an event happens, you can imagine the questions you're going to be asking. So hospital resilience was an interesting one. With the logistics and clinical transport, I did mention that we had a team from Sandia that did go to West Africa to gather data through the DITRA program that we work with on cooperative threat reduction. So we have a fair amount of experience of sending people into the field to do things like this. And they were mapping Ebola treatment units, diagnostic labs, routes, drive times, how you get back and forth, how you bring test samples, how long it takes to diagnose these things. So there was a big data part, there was a geospatial analytics part. Data had to be transformed into maps to be visualized, recognizing that a lot of the data was incomplete, anecdotal, and occasionally simply incorrect. And so doing that was not a simple task. Together with geospatial, we had a team looking at reducing the travel times in terms of bringing the ETUs, samples from the ETUs to the labs for testing. It was something which wasn't simple. And also algorithms to determine optimal locations of the laboratories. I don't know if you've seen any pictures of the routes there in the rainy season, but it is, deep mud. It's not a road, it's mud, and you just see vehicles stuck there. It is a challenge to move things around the country. You have to worry about things like national curfews, poor infrastructure, lab capacities, how you handle surge, and so on. And so the modeling becomes quite interesting in all its dimensionality. Sending people in to get the data is an important part of that. But I think that's a very interesting part of of things that we did. Was it helpful? Again, in my opinion, I think we did some interesting things. I think again that we started a little bit late. And by the time that we managed to release funds for this through a supplemental, it was already mid-December. And then as you start to pay for things, it takes a little longer. And by that time, we had already seen that the CDC forecasts of 1.4 million in January was not going to happen. And as the cases in the U.S., didn't reappear in any significant way, I think people's interest here also went away. And so, it was, it's still going. There was a recent surge in Guinea in the last week or two of cases, but I think it's off of most people's radar here. I don't think it should be. I think there's a lot of data to be gathered of lessons learned from Dallas, from the other hospitals that were impacted, to figure out what are the kinds of models we could be developing, what is the data we're going to need if we want to make some predictions in the future. And this is really the time to do it before the next event, to figure out how to validate these codes. So, as a support agency for this, again, it was interesting to see the government function as a whole, which it did, I think, very effectively. The White House, through John Holdren and his National Science and Technology Council, did lead the kind of science working group, which was all of government approach on how we draw in science, and we brought a lot of computational science there to support the interagency. I think that worked very well. I think with respect to travel bans, we were able to make impacts with respect to a lot of these quick turnaround questions of, we need to know over the weekend what this answer is to this question as best you can. We did a lot of that on a collection of problems. I think big picture, we have a lot to do in terms of how is this preparing us for the next whatever. My concern is that we simply let this pass and say it's over, let's get back to our day job. I think there's something that needs to be done here in terms of understanding what is the tool set we need, what is the data we should be gathering to understand how ready we are and what is it we can actually do. We don't have a lot of answers to those questions, but it is a field that is in deep need of modeling and simulation. I think it is a really explosive growth area in the years to come. And I hope it's not because of events like Ebola, but it's through a natural progression of thinking, of communities like this, of people who are engaged and worried about problems of this class. Well, thank you. I hope that was useful.